The time is precisely 1:47 a.m. A figure, face obscured, extends a hand toward Nancy Guthrie's front door camera. Then, nothing. 41 minutes pass before the digital connection to her pacemaker is severed. In that sliver of time, an 84-year-old woman vanishes. In the weeks that followed, the public was fed a narrative. This was the work of a professional kidnapper. The story included a multi-million-dollar ransom note in Bitcoin and the specter of a meticulous, dangerous offender. The problem was, the evidence told a completely different story. Rather than evade detection, the intruder seemed to play for the camera. The ransom demand wasn't a private threat to the family. It was a public spectacle for the media. Crucial, life-sustaining heart medication was left untouched. And the individuals in Nancy's innermost circle, people like Tomaso Chion and Dominic Evans, found themselves drawn into the quiet glare of the investigation. This was more than a simple case of a missing person. This was a sequence of events riddled with inconsistencies. Because if you analyze this case moment by moment, the focus shifts from who abducted Nancy Guthrie to a far more disturbing question. Who desperately needed those 41 minutes of digital blindness? And what was being concealed or corrected before the eyes of the world turned to this quiet street? The evening Nancy Guthrie went missing began with an air of complete normalcy. At 9:48 p.m., Tomaso Chion escorted his 84-year-old mother-in-law to her Pima County home. This detail is not an assumption. It is a fact, recorded in the official chronology of events provided by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. 2 minutes later, at 9:50, her garage door shut. In that moment, Tomaso Chion officially became the last confirmed individual to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive. Standard procedure in any American missing persons investigation is predictable. Authorities begin with those closest geographically and relationally. Who was the last to see them? Who had access to the victim? Who had the opportunity? It's not an accusation of guilt, it's investigative protocol. But the steps taken in the following days were anything but standard. Just days into the investigation, deputies served and executed a comprehensive search warrant at the home of Tomaso Chion. This wasn't a friendly knock on the door or a casual inquiry. It was a formal warrant executed by officers who entered the premises wearing blue latex gloves. For hours, they methodically documented the residence. They carried out numerous items, all sealed within standard-issue brown evidence bags. Onlookers noted the presence of a secure silver forensics case, the kind specifically designed for transporting sensitive digital hardware like laptops and mobile phones. If this was simply a routine step to eliminate a person of interest, why such an extensive operation? Then, on February 16th, the sheriff made a public statement, officially clearing Tomaso Chion and the rest of the family. He labeled them victims and called for an end to media speculation. But this is precisely where the official story and the investigative actions diverge. A law enforcement agency does not tear apart a home unless they are hunting for something very specific. Digital devices are not confiscated without probable cause. And when you factor in another name that began to surface, Dominic Evans, the questions don't shrink, they multiply. Because in the modern world, proximity isn't just about physical location, it's also digital. It's about relationships, it's about circumstances. And at the moment Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera was disabled at 1:47 a.m., the focus of the investigation subtly pivoted from who saw her last to who had the most to gain from what was about to unfold. The time is 1:47 a.m. The video feed from Nancy Guthrie's residence is cut. This isn't a technical malfunction or a loss of power. The final recorded frames show a masked figure deliberately reaching for the camera and disabling it by hand. The action is purposeful, controlled, and intentional. From that instant on, there are no more witnesses. In a textbook professional abduction, this would be the start of a swift extraction. Criminals motivated by ransom understand that time is the enemy. They do not linger. Each passing minute dramatically elevates the risk of exposure. A neighbor might wake up. A motion detector could be tripped. A police patrol could drive by. The longer an intruder remains on site, the higher the probability of being caught. But the digital breadcrumbs suggest a different scenario. Within the home, Nancy Guthrie was monitored by medical technology. Her pacemaker was linked via a Bluetooth signal to an application on her cell phone. That connection would remain live as long as she was in proximity to the device. Forensic data confirms that the Bluetooth link wasn't broken until 2:28 a.m. 2:28. That calculates to a 41-minute gap between the camera going dark and the pacemaker losing its signal. 41 minutes is not a smash-and-grab abduction. It doesn't suggest speed born of panic. It isn't efficient. It's a significant amount of time that could be used to search, to argue, to stage a scene, to make a decision. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. By all accounts, she had limited mobility and was dependent on medication for a serious heart condition. She would not have been physically able to put up a sustained fight against an assailant who was younger and stronger. Had the sole intention been to abduct her, the entire act could have been completed in under 5 minutes. So what happened during the other 36? Here, the official story starts to splinter, because throughout that 41-minute window, not a single neighbor reported hearing a scream. Not one security alarm was activated. No one inside the house dialed for help. The only documented silence is digital. And that kind of silence can be a strategy. Behind the scenes, investigators started to piece together a map of movement inside the home, using signal strength data and the timestamps from various digital devices. When you cross-reference that analysis with the established timeline, the fact that Tomaso Chion was the last person confirmed to have contact and that digital evidence came from his home gives that gap a chilling significance. It is then that the name Dominic Evans begins to circulate within law enforcement circles, not as a public suspect and not as someone formally charged, but as a figure linked by a web of communications and a disturbing proximity to the timeline. When you examine high-stakes criminal cases in the United States, a pivotal moment often arrives when investigators shift from asking who broke into the house to asking who needed unaccounted-for time inside it. 41 minutes is enough time to construct a cover story. 41 minutes is enough time to stage a scene for a camera. And 41 minutes is enough time for one crime to spiral into something far more permanent. The void between 147 and 228 is not an empty space. It is crowded with unnerving possibilities. Before the camera went dark at 1:47 in the morning, it captured something that was not just a crime in progress, but a performance. The figure seen on Nancy Guthrie's doorbell footage was deliberately encumbered, wearing bulky layers of clothing ill-suited for agile movement. Reports noted 2 masks, one layered on top of the other, 2 pairs of gloves, and thick clothes that would hinder, not help, a swift operation. That detail alone is telling. Professional criminals depend on dexterity. They need tactile sensitivity in their hands. They need to be mobile. Double gloving deadens the sense of touch. Heavy garments, slow reaction time. Everything about this attire suggests the priority was not efficiency, but ensuring no trace evidence was left behind. Then there is the handgun, which was positioned awkwardly in the front of the waistband. It was not holstered for stability, nor was it properly concealed. It was visible, almost presented. In a tactical scenario, weapons are secured for control and access. What we see in this footage appears more theatrical than functional. The gun's placement makes it insecure. It is meant to be seen. It is meant to signal danger. And that may have been the entire purpose, because instead of a rapid approach that avoids the camera, the masked subject pauses directly under the porch light. He operates in full view. He even bends down to the landscaping, audibly pulling at plants for several seconds. Why generate noise? Why maximize your time on camera? Why stay illuminated? Then, the most perplexing detail emerges. The subject looks directly into the camera lens. Not as a brief glance, not by accident, but with clear intent. In case after case of burglary and abduction across America, suspects instinctively avoid the camera's gaze. They duck their heads. They obscure their faces. They stick to blind spots. This individual did the exact opposite. He made sure he was seen. That single choice reframes the footage from incidental evidence to a carefully staged event. If the goal is to sell the narrative of a violent kidnapping, what could be more effective than creating a terrifying visual? A mask, a gun, threatening movements, followed by an abrupt loss of signal. The image is designed to be frightening. It is cinematic. It is memorable, but it is not efficient. When investigators later analyzed this footage frame by frame, behavioral specialists reportedly focused less on facial identification and more on deciphering intent. The movements were not those of a stealthy predator. They were a form of exaggerated signaling. Now, you must consider this performance against the backdrop of that earlier 41-minute gap. If the real objective had been ransom, speed would have been essential. If the objective had been a quiet abduction, subtlety would have been the key. But what we see here is pure dramatization. And when you have dramatization intersecting with known figures like Tomaso Chion and emerging connections to people like Dominic Evans, the fundamental question changes. Was the camera an obstacle to be avoided? Or was it an integral part of the script? Because when you want the world to believe a kidnapping occurred, the first thing you must manufacture is fear. And fear begins with an image. If the masked figure was meant to create fear, the ransom demand was meant to create urgency. Within days of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, messages started appearing, demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The figure was breathtaking. The tone was cold and direct. The threat was clear. Pay, or she would be lost forever. At first, it all seemed to fit the classic kidnapping narrative. But veteran investigators analyzed not just what is being asked for, but how it is being asked for. In nearly every authenticated ransom kidnapping in modern American history, the communications adhere to a strict pattern. The perpetrators make private contact with the family. They demand secrecy. They avoid any exposure to law enforcement. All negotiation is done in the shadows. Here, the exact opposite took place. Rather than discreet contact, emails were allegedly sent directly to media organizations, local news channels, national networks. Public visibility wasn't just tolerated, it was being actively courted. This is operationally suicidal. The instant the media is brought in, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is brought in. Specialized cryptocurrency tracing units went active. Digital forensic analysts initiated the painstaking process of mapping wallet pathways. Every single transaction was now under a microscope. Any party genuinely seeking a payout would instinctively avoid that kind of spotlight. Which brings us to the most glaring omission of all. There was no verifiable proof of life. Not a single photograph showing her holding a contemporary newspaper. No audio recording of her voice answering specific, predetermined questions. There was no video evidence to establish that Nancy Guthrie was alive after her abduction. In the rigid protocol of a ransom negotiation, proof of life is non-negotiable. Without it, making a payment is an act of pure irrationality. Now, introduce another variable into this equation. Inside Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators uncovered her essential heart medication. It was left behind, completely untouched. Nancy was dependent on a daily regimen of this medication to regulate a severe cardiac condition. She had a pacemaker for a critical reason. Removing her from that house without those prescriptions would have drastically collapsed her window of survival. A kidnapper intending to exchange a human life for millions of dollars prioritizes the health of that hostage. They secure necessary medications. They preserve their asset. Leaving the medication behind points to something else entirely. It suggests either profound ignorance or a chilling indifference. And indifference does not compute in the cold economics of a ransom. When you place the theatrical performance on the porch alongside the public ransom broadcast and then overlay the abandoned medication, the very architecture of the kidnapping theory starts to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Now, let's examine the intense investigative scrutiny that descended upon Tomaso Chion's residence. The seizure of digital devices, the exhaustive searches, and the official public statement that ultimately cleared him. Then, you must factor in Dominic Evans, a name that began surfacing with increasing frequency, linked by a web of relationships and communications during the initial stages of the investigation. No charges were filed, no official accusations were made, but proximity creates patterns, and patterns always generate questions. If this ransom was not fundamentally about money, what was its purpose? Distraction, delay, deflection. Because a public ransom spectacle forces everyone to look outward at cryptocurrency wallets and masked phantoms, instead of looking inward toward the intricate networks of personal relationships. If this was not an abduction engineered for a financial payout, then it may have been an abduction engineered to buy time. And in this case, time appears to be the most precious currency of all. In the very early stages of the investigation, authorities confirmed a detail that fundamentally shifted the emotional gravity of the case. Traces of blood were discovered near the entryway of Nancy Guthrie's home. Not a large quantity, not a scene saturated with violence, but enough to confirm that a physical confrontation had taken place at that door. Now, stop for a moment. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She reportedly suffered from issues with her mobility. She was dependent on medical intervention for her heart condition. To physically overpower her would not have required a significant or sustained use of force. If this were a calculated abduction for ransom, Violence severe enough to draw blood is illogical. A rational kidnapper would prioritize control without inflicting injury. Blood introduces risk. Its location was key. Not deep within the house, not in a bedroom, not down a hallway, but right there, near the entrance. That suggests something went catastrophically wrong from the very start. Possibility 1. Nancy confronted the person at her door. Possibility 2. She attempted to fight back. Possibility 3. She fell. But this is where a critical layer must be added. If an intruder panicked and caused a severe injury, the crime itself could have instantly transformed from a burglary or intimidation into something irreversible. That scenario would account for the 41-minute gap in the timeline. Not a period of waiting or negotiating, but of problem-solving, cleaning, staging, reframing the narrative. Because the moment blood is introduced, the stakes escalate exponentially. Now, consider how this theory aligns with the preceding evidence. The theatrical camera work, the public ransom broadcast, the medication left untouched. Each element starts to feel less like a coherent strategy and more like a desperate improvisation. Investigators who specialize in analyzing staged crime scenes frequently cite a common pattern. When a crime spirals out of control, the perpetrator will attempt to construct a louder, more dramatic narrative to drown out the original fatal mistake. In this case, the loud narrative was a multi-million-dollar kidnapping, but the quiet evidence was the blood at the door. Then you have the investigative pressure that was applied to Tomaso Chion. 2 forensic searches, digital devices seized, countless hours of examination, followed by an official, public exoneration. But clearing someone publicly does not erase the fact that investigators considered their proximity to the victim with extreme seriousness. And when Dominic Evans emerges on the investigative landscape, connected by a lattice of relationships and communications under review, the circle of interest tightens further still. There were no accusations, no formal charges. But when you map proximity, opportunity, and behavior after the event, undeniable patterns begin to solidify. The blood on the threshold is not merely a forensic detail. It is the point where theory collides with physics. Something violent happened in that space, something unexpected. And if what transpired at that doorway was not part of a planned ransom plot, then everything that followed may have been an elaborate construction designed to hide that single chaotic moment. Because once blood appears, the story changes. In modern investigations, people lie. A device doesn't lie. Every call placed, every message transmitted, every application launched, every single Bluetooth signal connected or severed. These digital footprints create an invisible timeline, one that speaks with more authority than any human witness. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, as physical evidence began to raise more questions than answers, investigators turned their focus entirely toward a digital reconstruction of events. And that is where the narrative began to darken. Nancy's pacemaker was more than just a medical instrument. It was a data recorder. It was in constant Bluetooth communication with her cell phone. That electronic tether remained active until 2:28 in the morning. That is 41 minutes after the doorbell camera was taken offline. But investigators were studying something far more nuanced. Movement, fluctuations in signal strength, shifts in device location, background application processes, and interruptions in power. These microscopic digital traces allow analysts to approximate motion within a building, even in total darkness. The moment the digital forensics team carried devices from Tomaso Chioni's home in secure, signal-blocking evidence cases, it was a profound signal. Those cases are reserved for one purpose: preserving the absolute integrity of electronic data. This meant investigators were convinced the truth was stored on those devices. They were hunting for everything: text message, threads, call logs, the ghosts of deleted data, and location pings. They analyzed the frequency of communication before the incident and after. Then, a new name surfaced during the review: Dominic Evans. Again, he was not charged, nor was he publicly accused, but he was connected through relational mapping, a standard protocol law enforcement uses when dissecting a victim's inner circle. In major criminal investigations across the United States, digital proximity can be far more revealing than physical presence. Who was communicating in the final hours before she vanished? Who fell silent right after? Who deleted conversations? Who suddenly altered their patterns? 41 minutes inside a home is a window of time for much more than just physical action. It is enough time to use a device, to send a coordination, to receive a confirmation, to react. If some part of the plan inside that house went wrong, Digital communication could become the most critical evidence of all. And here lies the unsettling truth of digital forensics. Even after messages are erased, their shadows remain. Metadata persists. Cloud backups linger. Cell tower pings log coordinates. Investigators don't just analyze the content, they analyze the silence. An abrupt silence between two people who normally communicate constantly raises immediate red flags. Now, you overlay this reality with the public ransom demand. If the ransom emails were blasted to media outlets, they had to come from somewhere, an account, a network, a specific device. Even encrypted communications leave behind a digital scent if the execution isn't perfect. If the true objective was ransom, why risk the exposure that comes with traceable, public communication? But if the objective was to create a distraction, then that very public communication serves an entirely different and calculated purpose. When analysts chart a timeline, they are searching for convergence points, the precise moments where a physical event and a digital one intersect. At 1:47 a.m., the camera is disconnected. At 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker signal ends. In that narrow window, what other digital activity was occurring? This is where the real investigation quietly unfolds. Long after public attention has shifted to the spectacle, Tomaso Chioni's devices were analyzed. Dominic Evans's connections were put under the microscope, because in the final analysis, devices cannot perform. Devices cannot stage fear, they only record reality. And when the digital record begins to align too perfectly with opportunity, and not with randomness, the theory of a stranger abduction becomes exceptionally fragile. The question is no longer simply, who entered Nancy Guthrie's home? It's who else was digitally active during those 41 minutes, even if they were miles away. On February 16th, the Pima County Sheriff stood before a wall of cameras and delivered what was meant to be a conclusive statement. Tomaso Chion, he announced, along with other immediate family members, had been publicly cleared. The sheriff urged the public for compassion. He demanded the media stop its speculation. He referred to the family as victims. To the millions watching from home, it sounded like a resolution. But experienced observers know that a public clearing does not halt an investigation. It simply means that based on the evidence available at that moment, there wasn't enough to file charges. There is a chasm between not enough evidence and no questions remain. Why were there two separate searches of Tomaso Chioni's residence? Why were his digital devices seized and subjected to forensic analysis? Why would investigators commit so many hours to that property if suspicion was truly minimal? The answer often lies in legal diligence. In major prosecutions, defense attorneys will almost certainly argue that investigators failed to properly clear those closest to the victim. If law enforcement doesn't exhaustively probe the inner circle, a future suspect's legal team can allege investigative bias or tunnel vision. So, homes are sometimes searched not to prove that someone is guilty, but to prove that the investigators themselves were not negligent. However, this is where the narrative tension increases. The scale of this particular search was significant. Witnesses described seeing deputies wearing blue medical gloves, carrying out multiple evidence bags. The use of secure digital transport cases wasn't a random detail. It spoke to a calculated, systematic mind. And then, a new name emerges from the data. Dominic Evans. Tomaso Chion was a name the public knew. Dominic Evans was not. He operated in the shadows of the initial media storm. But in the world of criminal investigation, headlines are irrelevant. Proximity isn't about fame, it's about connections. Connections woven through communication logs, through moments that align on a timeline, through the subtle overlap of social circles. Analysts grappling with a complex case will often construct a map of concentric circles. At the very center are individuals with direct physical contact. The next ring out captures anyone with recent interactions. It's in the outer rings, the nodes of indirect communication, that something critical appears. Both Tomaso Chion and Dominic Evans begin to populate the same overlapping zones of proximity. No formal charges are filed, but behind the scenes, this does not go unnoticed. Publicly, the goal is to reassure a frightened community. Privately, the investigation is about one thing: finding answers. And at times, those two objectives run on entirely separate, parallel tracks. A public statement of clearance doesn't stop the digital forensics. It doesn't halt the meticulous process of mapping relationships, and it certainly doesn't mean the deep dive into a person's background is frozen. All it means is that the legal threshold required for an arrest has not yet been met. But when you piece together the evidence, the 41-minute gap inside the house, the staged performance at the doorbell, the critical medication left behind, the traces of blood on the threshold, and you add the bizarre public theater of the ransom demand, then overlay all of it with the exhaustive data mapping that links Tomaso Chion and Dominic Evans, a new picture forms. The clean, linear story of a kidnapping begins to fracture, revealing something far more complex and layered beneath the surface. The question that hangs in the air is this: if this were a simple random abduction by an outsider, why do all the investigative threads lead back toward those closest to the victim, instead of spiraling outward into the world of organized crime? This is the question that seasoned analysts whisper behind closed doors, and the answer to that question could be the key that decides if this case remains an unsolved mystery or if it evolves into something deeply, disturbingly personal. When homicide detectives believe a crime scene has been staged, they search for one telltale signature: a fundamental mismatch, a disconnect between the stated motive and the observed behavior, a contradiction between the supposed urgency and the actual actions taken, a deep chasm between the typical patterns of a professional criminal and the strange anomalies of the scene. In the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, these mismatches are not subtle, they are everywhere. A multi-million-dollar ransom is demanded, but there is never any proof that she is alive. The abduction is framed as the work of professionals, yet the perpetrator lingers inside the residence for a full 41 minutes. The victim is a frail, 84-year-old woman, yet her essential, life-sustaining medication is left behind. Each one of these contradictions acts like a chisel, chipping away at the foundation of the kidnapping story. Staging a crime scene is not about creating a perfect illusion. It's about misdirection. The objective isn't to erase all evidence. The objective is to contaminate the investigation by flooding it with conflicting signals. Consider the sheer volume of noise generated in this case. A masked figure performing under the glare of a porch light, an almost cartoonish display of a weapon, emails blasted directly to media outlets, demands for cryptocurrency designed to create digital chaos and capture national headlines. It's all incredibly loud, and loud events are the perfect cover for quiet truths. What if something went terribly wrong inside that home within the first few moments? An accident, a sudden fall, a confrontation that escalated beyond control. The person responsible would have been faced with a stark choice: flee the scene and wait for a homicide investigation to begin at sunrise, or remove the body and invent an entirely different story. A kidnapping narrative does one thing very effectively: it buys time. And that brings us back to proximity. Tomaso Chion. He was proximity personified. He is the last individual confirmed to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive. That single fact, by itself, ensures the highest level of scrutiny. It's not proof of guilt, but it makes him the anchor point for the entire timeline. Dominic Evans enters the picture through a different vector: relational proximity. In a case this complex, investigators must analyze the possibility of an accomplice, a second party who could assist with post-event logistics like transportation, communications, or creating a digital smokescreen. Again, no charges, no public accusation. But the act of staging a crime scene often requires more than one person. One to create the initial chaos, and another to help construct and support the cover story. If that performance on the front porch was a calculated act, it implies a knowledge of the camera's field of view. If the ransom emails were strategically leaked to the press, it implies an understanding of how to manipulate the media. Staging is the act of imposing a plan onto chaos, and that 41-minute gap is the perfect window of opportunity for that plan to be conceived. And when analysts deconstruct a staged scene, they look for signs of overcompensation, too much drama, an abundance of clues, a suspect who is almost too visible. The masked figure on the porch feels exaggerated. The ransom demand feels theatrical. The use of cryptocurrency feels like a plot point from a movie. It all feels carefully constructed, and if something is constructed, it must have an author. This line of reasoning leads directly to the most unsettling possibility in this entire case. If the evidence doesn't support a kidnapping for financial gain, and it doesn't fit the pattern of a random burglary gone wrong, then the entire motive may have been misidentified. It may be deeply personal. Once investigators strip away all the spectacle and noise, they are left with one foundational question. Why? Not how was it done? Not who was the figure on the camera? Not what was the dollar amount in the ransom note. Why was Nancy Guthrie taken from her home that night? A true kidnapping for ransom is predicated on one thing: keeping the asset alive. It demands care, preservation, and a patient negotiation. So if money was not the primary driver, then what was? When you remove money from the equation, what motives are left? In complex criminal psychologies, the answer is almost always found in proximity: a financial strain, the timing of an inheritance, a festering conflict, the fear of being exposed, or simple, raw desperation. At the heart of this web, one connection is inescapable: Tomaso Chion's proximity to Nancy Guthrie. He was the last person known to have contact with her. Investigators immediately examined the paper trail. Were there recent alterations to gun, wills, trusts, or power of attorney documents? Were there private tensions, invisible to the public eye? These are not accusations. They are the methodical pathways of any standard investigation. And it was this protocol that led to another name appearing in the relational map: Dominic Evans. In an investigation, proximity is more than just a shared address. It is a current woven through communication patterns, shared circles, financial overlaps, and privileged access. In major cases all across the United States, investigators often uncover secondary participants, not because they initiated the crime, but because they provided assistance in its aftermath: transportation, digital coordination, or simply the emotional reinforcement needed to maintain the lie. If a catastrophic event occurred unexpectedly inside Nancy's home, a confrontation that escalated, a fall that proved fatal, the first response would not be a calculated ransom strategy. It would be pure panic. Panic compels phone calls. Calls lead to coordination. Coordination builds a cover story. That 41-minute gap suddenly acquires a chilling new significance. It was not a time of waiting or negotiating. It was a time of deciding. If Nancy's condition was deteriorating rapidly without her medication, and an injury occurred at the threshold, the window for her survival may have closed with terrifying speed. At that moment, the entire motive shifts. The objective is no longer about gain. It's about avoiding accountability. And avoiding accountability often requires the construction of a much larger story, a narrative dramatic enough to completely obscure the original catastrophic mistake. Theatrical footage, a manufactured media frenzy, demands for cryptocurrency, it is all noise. Noise is designed to make investigators look outward, but proximity always pulls their focus back inward. And when the investigative circles repeatedly tighten around known figures instead of expanding towards some unknown criminal network, seasoned observers start to ask a quiet but persistent question: was this ever about a stranger at the door? Or was it about someone who already knew exactly where that door was and what was on the other side? Then comes the silence after the storm. When the headlines fade, when the camera crews pack up, when the public arguments go quiet, hey team, what is left is an unnerving silence. Nancy Guthrie is still gone. No verified proof of life, no confirmed recovery, no ransom paid, no public arrest, just silence. And in an investigation of this nature, that kind of silence is rarely an accident. Had this been a professionally organized kidnapping for ransom, the playbook is predictable. There would be continued negotiation, continued pressure, continued communication. Criminal enterprises motivated by money do not simply give up and walk away when a payment fails to arrive. They escalate. But in this case, the escalation never came. The noise of the ransom demand flared brightly, and then it was extinguished. That detail is profoundly important, because staged events often collapse under their own weight once their primary purpose has been served. If the goal was simply a distraction, then once public attention moves on and time passes, the need for the elaborate theatrics fades away. Now, step back and view the entire mosaic. A masked figure performing for the camera under porch lights. A handgun displayed not with confidence, but with an odd awkwardness. 41 unexplained minutes inside the home. Blood found at the entryway. Life-saving medication left behind. Public ransom demands issued with no proof of life. The exhaustive searches of Tomaso Chion's residence. The seizure of his digital devices for deep forensic analysis. The relational proximity mapping that firmly includes Dominic Evans. Individually, each detail is a question mark, but taken together, they form an immense pressure. Pressure does not automatically equal guilt, but it creates a powerful gravitational pull. In complex investigations, detectives often speak of the truth, as having a quality that resists chaos. You can stage a crime scene. You can manufacture noise. You can create terrifying images for a camera. But eventually, the timelines have to align. Digital records must be reconciled. The motive must be logical. And right now, this case does not align with the narrative of a random, external kidnapping. It aligns far more closely with a scenario of proximity, improvisation, and a narrative constructed after the event. The final question is not simply who disconnected the camera at 1:47 in the morning. It is who benefited from the 41 minutes that followed. Because in those 41 minutes, something irreversible happened. And until the silence breaks, until the digital trails are fully illuminated, until the physical evidence leads to a definitive place, the names connected by this web of proximity will continue to exist just beneath the surface of this investigation. Tomaso Chion, Dominic Evans, not declared guilty, not formally charged, but now inseparable from the timeline. And timelines, unlike stories, do not perform, they reveal. Now, the only thing left is patience. Because truth, when it finally emerges, does not need to shout. The case of Nancy Guthrie serves as a haunting reminder that in the theater of shadows, the loudest performance is often the greatest lie. We are taught to fear the masked stranger at the door, but this story reveals a more chilling reality. The most profound betrayals often come from within the circles we trust most. While humans can manufacture fear and stage elaborate spectacles to buy time, they cannot silence the digital echoes of the truth. A pacemaker's final signal, a timed heartbeat, and a severed connection speak with an authority that no scripted ransom note can ever match. In our modern age, justice is no longer just a physical pursuit. It is a meticulous reconstruction of the silent footprints we leave behind. The ultimate lesson is one of integrity and vigilance. We must look past the noise of the world, the sensational headlines, and the calculated distractions to find the quiet, ignored evidence of a human life. Nancy's story warns us that every action, no matter how hidden, leaves an indelible mark. In the end, time does not just pass, it reveals. Let us value the truth over the performance, for only the truth can break the silence of the lost.